Each and every day, enjoy the Simple Six menu at Subway, an entire made-for-you meal featuring one of six-inch sandwiches like the Italian BMT or Black Forest ham, with any bag of chips and a 21-ounce drink, all for only $6. Subway. Eat fresh.
The B.S. Report is a free-flowing conversation that occasionally touches on mature subjects. The B.S. Report. The B.S. Report with Bill Simmons.
Welcome to the B.S. Report, taping this on a Monday. It is running Tuesday morning, same day of Free Spirits, which is our latest 30 for 30. It's about the ABA's St. Louis Spirits. Actually, the Spirit of St. Louis. I said that wrong. I always messed that up. It is running ESPN Tuesday night, 8 p.m. One of the people in the documentary, his first gig announcing the Spirits, Bob Costas, broadcasting legend, has somehow never been on the B.S. Report, but great job in the documentary, and great to have you in the B.S. Report.
You know, it's important, Bill, to say Spirits of St. Louis. A small group of us to whom it matters make that distinction because the team was named after Charles Lindbergh's plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, which is associated with the city. And it had one of the great logos in the history of sports, that Lindbergh-style plane kind of swooping and the last S underlining the whole insignia and the plane sort of flying off into the distance. If the team had lasted, that would rank way up there among the all-time logos.
And we have, if you go to the 30 for 30 website and you click on the Free Spirits page that we have, there's a picture of that plane and all the dudes standing in front of it, including one of my faves ever, Bad News Barnes, who had a cup of coffee with the Celtics when I was a kid. I wrote about this in my book. My dad and I had the season tickets. They moved us right to the tunnel because the team was terrible. Bad News Barnes showed up on that team for like 30 games and spent one of those games wearing a mink coat, standing right next to me watching the Celtic game, and it was amazing. He was
that was kind of typical of Marvin. I don't think you could find a basketball man who wouldn't say that had he remained healthy, and he really had no serious injuries. It was all self-destructive stuff, drugs and all other kind of activity. But if he had stayed on the straight and narrow, there's no way he would not have been among the 50 greatest players in pro basketball history, honored in 1997 on the 50th anniversary of the NBA. I mean, the guy was so good that there were nights when I saw him completely outplay Dr. J, completely outplay Moses Malone. He was that good, but he just screwed his whole career up.
And he would have like 45 points and 26 rebounds.
Yeah. He had games like
often.
That.
Yeah. Who is his, what player would you compare him to?
You know, I don't know exactly because he had a kind of quickness. He played a power forward and occasionally they would move him to center. But he was a lean guy. He was 6'9", but you wouldn't say he was a burly power forward type like a George McGinnis or a Maurice Lucas, guys who were contemporaries. He had a good outside shot, but he was very quick with the first step. He almost had guard-like quickness off the dribble to go to the basket. And he was a quick jumper, if you know what I mean. I mean, he could elevate quickly and would beat bigger guys to the rebound just by getting off the floor and positioning himself better.
And he was not somebody who took it easy off the court. He did not have a personal trainer. I'm guessing his diet was not gluten-free.
This is a true story. Before a playoff game, the guy ate like a bag of McDonald's in the locker room. I mean, a bag, not like one Big Mac or something, like 4 or 5 of them. You know, yeah. Just he didn't care. And he cruised around in a Rolls Royce. He had a Rolls Royce, and he would drive around town, often go through the inner city, and pick up kids. And he would bring like a half dozen random kids to the game. He'd pull up in front of the old arena where the Blues and the Spirits played, and there were several NCAA Final Fours played there over the years. He'd literally pull up, not even to the players' lot, but right in front, and he would just toss the keys to like some guy standing there. The kids would pile out of the car. He'd often show up like a half an hour before the game, exasperating everybody, and then he'd go out and score 30 and pull in 20 rebounds.
And there was the other story. I mean, the documentary hits a lot of these, but he also chartered his own plane because he was going to be late to a game.
Yeah, we had played the Nets, who then were on Long Island, played the Nets, and the next morning we've got to fly to Virginia, and this is before teams chartered. So we're taking a commercial flight out of LaGuardia to Norfolk, Virginia to play the late lamented Virginia Squires. And nobody was surprised when Marvin didn't make the bus and he missed the first 3 or 4 flights. But we thought for sure that he'd be on an early afternoon flight and get there in enough time, at least by his standards. Lord knows what Marvin was doing in New York after the game and into the wee hours of the morning or past dawn. But eventually he gathers himself and concludes that the only way he can make it is to charter his own plane, which he does. And he shows up literally minutes before the game. And the door swings open to the visitors' locker room where they're already convinced that they're going to have to play without him. And the coach, who was Bob McKinnon, is diagramming all the various strategies and people have to shift positions. And he has a beaming smile on his face as the door swings open. And he says, "Boys, game time is on time. Have no fear. Daddy News is here." And McKinnon just threw the chalk up in the air, turned away. As a slap on the wrist, I guess he benched him for the first 5 minutes of the game, but put him in. And if memory serves, he got 41 points and 19 rebounds in that game.
Well, the slap on the wrist certainly showed Marvin the error of his ways.
That changed his ways going forward.
Marvin was 22. Your first season, actually the Spirits' first season in St. Louis. Marvin was 22 years old, averaged 24 points a game and 15.6 rebounds a game, which the ABA stats are a little skewed because, I mean, you were there. Each team probably had, I would say, 4 like real NBA players, and then a lot of the roster filler. That first Spirits team had a guy named Fly and a guy named Goo.
Yeah.
That's fun for a broadcaster.
Fly Williams, playground legend in Brooklyn, and Eugene Goo Kennedy, who was kind of a workman-like guy, did a lot of the dirty work, rebounder, defensive specialist. Fly Williams was known for many things, one of which was when he played at Austin P, which he did briefly. I think he came out after his sophomore year. But the actual student chant at the games was, "The fly is open, let's go P."
I didn't know that.
Yeah, there you go.
Fly Williams at Austin P. I guess there's a certain synergy there. Yeah. Is it fair to say this Spirits team would have broken the internet had it come along 40 years later?
Oh, my gosh. You can't even imagine what would have happened. And you're right about the general depth of ABA teams, but the very best players, it was clearly shown, were not only of NBA quality, many of them were of All-Star and a few were of Hall of Fame quality. The first NBA final after the merger between Portland and Philadelphia, half of the 10 starters for the Sixers and the Trailblazers had been ABA players, and 10 of the 24 All-Stars in the first All-Star game post-merger had been ABA players. So there was little doubt about the cream at the very top. The league didn't have many first-rate centers other than Artis Gilmore and 1 or 2 others, but the guards and forwards, the best of them, were very, very good.
Yeah, I had always loved the ABA as a kid just because getting the basketball cards back then, it was like, what's going on with this league? There's this secret league out there. It's not, the games aren't televised, but Dr. J's seems cool and just no information whatsoever. There's no sports center. There's really no way to know what was going on other than, like, how many national ABA games did they even show? Like, just a couple?
Very, very few. And that's a point that I've made through the years, and I don't know if it makes it into the documentary or not, but the ABA might be the last significant sports enterprise in this country that is shrouded in some mystery. Yeah. After that, everything that we cared about was on television, and increasingly you saw it from 6, 10, 20 different angles. You could replay it any way you wanted. It was hashed and rehashed on SportsCenter and then later on the Internet. And so when people say the legendary Michael Jordan, it's really not accurate, unless you're talking about some story you heard about him being cut from his high school team. But everything Michael Jordan did from North Carolina and then through the NBA, as fantastic as it may have been, it's not legendary because it's all documented. We saw it all. Satchel Paige is legendary. Michael Jordan isn't legendary for whatever else he might be. But Dr. J in the ABA, that is legendary because, as you said, a lot of it was seen by only a relative handful of people, and you get like point of view stories. Well, this is what I remember of the dunk on Louis Dampier at Freedom Hall in front of 8,000 people in 1974. No, I saw it this way. So you get that kind of apocryphal aspect to things that doesn't exist anymore in sports.
Yeah, I remember I was 7 years old. The leagues had just merged, and they had that cover, and it was Dr. J and Dave Cowens with their arms around each other. And
like the merger of two worlds.
yeah. And the legend of Dr. J at that point, because we would get the Sporting News and Sports Illustrated, so he'd get covers, twice a year. All I knew about Dr. J was just what I read from those things. And in my head, I just had this guy who, could jump 60 inches and could dunk over all five guys at once. I didn't know what to expect. And he had a really good first season for Philly. They made the finals. But the legend that had been built up with Dr. J was almost had nothing in common because things get blown out of proportion. But at the same time, and you were there and all the ABA people from that mid-'70s, they all said Doc was better in the NBA than in the NBA.
Yeah, he was better in the ABA. But he was still really good, really, really good in the NBA. I mean, think of the move in the '80 finals against the Lakers, where he comes from the right baseline, goes under the basket, and back out the other end like some sort of soaring condor, and makes that reverse bucket. That it wasn't just a great move; it was a startling move. It was like, what? What? Did that happen?
Yeah, he ushered in what eventually would happen with Jordan. He won an MVP. They made the finals a bunch of times. But I think when he was in the ABA, especially those last 3 years, there was a feeling like this guy has a chance to be the greatest basketball player of all time. The ABA, you're playing 84 games a season, I guess. Crazy travel, bad floors. Part of me wonders, like, did he just leave some of it back in that other league? What do you think?
Possible. Some of it may have been stylistic, too. The defenses were not as tight in the ABA. It was a more freewheeling game. A certain type of play was encouraged. Maybe he was, by degree, better able to dominate in the ABA than in the deeper NBA, but he was still an all-timer in the NBA. And, when you talk about the ABA in general and the Spirits in particular, I know you've read Terry Pluto's Loose Balls, which is one of the great sports books. It's an oral history of the ABA. And Terry himself said 20 years ago, or whenever that book came out, that as wild and unpredictable and crazy as the ABA was in general, the one franchise that embodied all of it to the greatest extent was the Spirits. Even though they only lasted for 2 years, everything that was wonderful and exasperating and crazy and unbelievable about the ABA was encapsulated in those 2 years in St. Louis.
And, I spent a lot of time researching my book, and the NBA dropped off from a quality standpoint in the mid-'70s. And you look at, the 76 Celtics somehow won the title. They had an older team. The Cavaliers almost made the finals. And you look at the guys in the team, and you think, that's weird. Austin Carr was the best player in the 76 Cavs, and they almost made the finals. That's strange.
Hey, don't diss Bingo Smith.
And Bingo Smith. But then you look at the guys that were in the ABA, and they, over a 5-year span, they had cherry-picked, 20 of the best professional basketball players. And not just that, but guys who are on their way up. Like because they were able to bend some of the rules and sign guys early out of college and guys straight from high school. All of a sudden, they have young Moses, they have Ice Garvin, Julius Erving, the Artist Gilmore. Like, year after year, they're cherry picking one or two of these guys. The Spirits in the second season, that's when Moses showed up. And what's your best Moses story?
Well, let's see. Moses, you remember Gary Bender, who for a long time was prominent on CBS?
Yeah, the announcer.
Yeah. Well, he actually did local sports in St. Louis as well as doing network sports at the same time. He was the local TV sports anchor for the CBS affiliate in St. Louis. And so when the Utah Stars folded, the Spirits picked up some of their players, including a very good guard named Ron Boone, and most prominently Moses, in a dispersal draft. So now an already strong Spirits roster gets these guys. And so Gary Bender goes out to the practice facility to interview Moses Malone. And he says, Moses, last year as a rookie, you did this, that, and the other thing. Now you joined the Spirits team. What are your goals for this year? And Moses must have paused for like 10 seconds, staring at Gary, and then finally concluded by answering, "I'll keep it all to myself."
Wow.
A man of mystery was Moses.
He really was. He goes straight from high school, gets signed, ends up in Utah, which seems not kind of a strange place for Moses to have his first team. Then comes all the way to this. Yeah. Especially then. Then goes to St. Louis. One of the weirdest professional rosters ever put together, the second Spirits team, which eventually they disbanded. But you had Marvin Barnes, who was still kind of in his ABA prime. You had Ron Boone, who you mentioned, and Freddie Lewis, two really good ABA guards at the time. ML Carr, who ended up becoming a principal guy in the Celtics. Caldwell Jones, the same thing for the Sixers. Maurice Lucas, who became an all-star power forward and won the 77 title with Portland. Moses, Don Chaney. And then you go down the line, there's Mike D'Antoni.
Yep.
He was on that team.
He was on that team.
Yeah, so a lot of names. But he's
in the documentary, too.
Yeah.
You know, the Spirits had their moments. They never quite pulled it all together, but it was just such a strange and wonderful and memorable ride. And in my career, the very first job that I had was doing minor league hockey while I was still a student at Syracuse University, the Syracuse Blazers of the old Eastern Hockey League. And that's the actual Paul Newman Slapshot League. In fact, I knew guys who were extras in the movie. It was based on that league.
Yeah.
The Chiefs franchise that Newman plays for in the movie is really based on the Johnstown Jets of that league. And the screenwriter was the sister of a guy named Ned Dowd, who played goalie for the Johnstown Jets. And the character, Ogie Oglethorpe, who's kind of the goon, he's based on a guy who was on the Blazers, Bill Harpo Goldthorpe, and I broadcast the games that Goldthorpe was involved in. So that was job one. A year later, I'm doing the Spirits. So the two most ridiculous, absurd, almost impossible to duplicate situations of my entire professional life happened back to back. And while I realized that they were crazy, it was only decades and decades later, when nothing ever even remotely approaching it had happened to me, that I realized that the two most remarkable situations in my entire professional life had happened by the time I was 23 years old.
Wow. And the same could be said. Marvin Barnes could say the same thing.
Yeah, if he remembers any of it.
The shocking thing about that first Spirit season, they go into the playoffs. They're like a 30-win team, and then they beat Dr. J and the Nets.
They were 30-50, as I remember, and they had lost all 11 regular season games to the Nets, and then they lost the first game of the series at the Nassau Coliseum, although they played them close. And then from there, they won the next 4 games in a row.
Crazy. And Dr. J at his all-time apex at the time too. This was the 3-year run.
He actually had a turnover in Game 5 with them leading by a point with about 15 seconds to go. He lost the dribble, and the Spirits got the ball back, and Freddie Lewis made a dramatic shot from the top of the circle as time ran out to win the game by a point and close out the series. And then they were playing the Kentucky Colonels pretty much on even terms in the next round, until Freddie, who was really key and was having a great postseason, twisted his ankle in Game 4, and then the Spirits wound up losing that game and then losing Game 5. And Kentucky went on to win the championship by beating Indiana in the finals. It's entirely possible that had that injury not happened, that the Spirits could have won the ABA championship after finishing 20 games under 500 during the regular season. And
Marvin Barnes, maybe he turns his life around. No, that never would happen.
That may be hoping for a bit too much. But as you may know, and as you will see in this documentary, Marvin remains this high-spirited, irresistible character. Every one of us really liked the guy. There was no malice in him, and he was so funny. He was so genuinely clever. He was like a lowercase Muhammad Ali. He was just so entertaining. You couldn't stay mad at him. Of course, you were exasperated that he was frittering away all of this incredible talent and putting his life literally in jeopardy with some of the people he was associating with. And, he wound up in jail for a stretch, wound up living under a bridge for a stretch, now has pulled his life more or less back together. But when you think of what it could have been and what it was, there's an element of sadness to it. But then every time I cross paths with Marvin and every time I talk to him, there's still a bounce in his step and a liveliness in his approach, and he's still just as funny as he once was. So he's a unique and irresistible character.
Let's just say that you don't earn the nickname Bad News by accident.
Yeah. It helps if you hit a teammate on the head with a tire iron, which apparently he did when he was at Providence. Yeah. And when you go AWOL from your team and early in your rookie season and turn up shooting pool somewhere in Dayton, Ohio, while your team is on the road playing a series of games, these things tend to accumulate.
Are you glad or are you not glad that there's basically no videotape whatsoever of these 2 years of Spirits games and some of the calls you had?
I'm glad that so much of it is shrouded in mystery and word of mouth. It adds mystique to it. There are a few tapes. There are a lot of radio tapes. KMOX saved a lot of the radio tapes. And I know that ESPN Classic has at least one game, televised game, that was a simulcast. We did radio and television, same broadcast. Spirits at Kentucky, and they played that a few times. And part of it makes me smile, and part of it makes me wince. I was 22 years old, so I guess there was room for improvement.
And in that game, I'm pretty sure I remember this correctly. You were announcing some of it with the owner, right?
No, the owner's wife.
Oh, the owner's wife. Yeah.
Actually, the president of the team, Harry Weltman. His wife, Arlene, was a very charming woman who knew her basketball but had no broadcasting experience. But one of the sponsors was smitten with her because she had been interviewed during a game, and he found her charming and well-spoken. And his idea was, why don't you have her work with Bob on the television games? And that's what happened.
So you're doing games. You're announcing this completely insane team with the president's wife.
Yeah,
or the owner's wife.
It was an entirely objective, journalistically excellent broadcast.
What did you know that, were you expecting to come back for year 3, or did you know that team was getting disbanded?
As year 2 wore on, and we thought we could kind of capitalize on the late success of the first season and the depth of the roster, a lot of old-face names, we thought that attendance would pick up, and it really didn't. We averaged 2,500, 3,000 fans a game. And there were some games where in this cavernous arena, there were less than 1,000 people there. And I remember shaking my head. There was a game between San Antonio and the Spirits. So you got Marvin Barnes on the floor and all those players that you mentioned from the Spirits, and Larry Keenan and George Gervin and James Silas. Really good San Antonio team that was competitive right away when they got into the NBA. And there were 840 people there one night. So we knew that the sand was going through the hourglass, and that one of two things would happen. If the ABA remained intact, they had planned to move the franchise to Utah, where the Stars had folded only a few months before. So they were going to move them to Utah, or they were going to hope to get in to the NBA when the ABA folded and a handful of ABA franchises got in, but the Spirits weren't one of them. The four that got in were the Pacers, the Nets, the Spurs, and the Nuggets.
Well, and then there's a crucial wrinkle to this story that I don't want to spoil for the people who don't know the story, but it's a big piece of the 30 for 30 that you should watch tonight on ESPN, 8 o'clock Tuesday night. There's an unbelievable wrinkle with the Spirits. Screw it. Let's spoil it. They don't get in the NBA, but they get a cut of the media rights or the TV rights forever, basically. Yeah. And it seems like this throwaway percentage at the time, but no, it's turned into hundreds of millions of dollars.
Correct. So actually they do better than almost any ownership group in all of sports.
It actually might be the single greatest thing to own because you're not putting up any money whatsoever. You're just, all people do are just sending you checks.
Yep. In effect, they walk to the mailbox, remove the envelope, cash the checks, and that's it. No overhead of any kind. No office expense, no travel expense, no arena expense, no player payroll, no nothing. Just send us the checks. And the NBA has tried to settle with them many times over the years. And the Silna brothers, who were the primary owners of the team, have just smiled and said, no thanks, we'll just take our cut of the ever-growing television pie, and here's the part in italics, in perpetuity.
Forever. And I know for a fact that this drives David Stern crazier than anything that's ever happened, basically. There's no legal way to weasel out of it. You just can't. It's in perpetuity. That's it.
Yeah, he wasn't the commissioner then. Larry O'Brien was, but of course he was the league counsel at the time. And I don't know exactly what input he had into that deal, but it's a deal that the NBA definitely regrets.
And especially when you look at what some of those other franchises went for. So what'd you do after the team disbanded? What was your next job?
Well, luckily for me, KMOX, being the truly great station that it still is, but especially then was, because this is before ESPN, before the internet, before the explosion in cable television of sports and everything else. So the 50,000-watt radio stations, the 3WEs in Cleveland, the KDKAs in Pittsburgh, KMOX in St. Louis, those stations, which almost all carried major sports events, had tremendous influence. And maybe KMOX the most of all because of where it was situated. On a clear night, it could be heard in 40 different states. And it was where Jack Buck and Harry Carey and Joe Garagiola and a whole long list, Dan Kelly, the best hockey announcer of his era, all those people had been or were at KMOX. And I was lucky to join that staff. Later, Joe Buck and Dan Deerdorf worked there, people like that. And so they liked me, and after the Spirits folded, they kept me there, and they had me do Missouri basketball and Missouri football, and occasionally if Dan Kelly or Jack Buck had another assignment, I would fill in on a Blues game or on a Cardinals game. And then not long after that, I started doing stuff for NBC while remaining in St. Louis for a while, and eventually moved full-time to NBC.
I remember as a kid, I remember you were doing some football, but then when you really moved into my life was when you grew a Letterman connection. And I'm doing this from memory, but I'm going to say it was like the second or third anniversary show. What was the one you were on?
Well, the first time I was on was only a month or two into his run in late night on NBC in 1982, and I did the elevator races, which were one of his signature things. So, mock serious call of elevator races. And then he did dog sled races in the hallway on the 6th floor, and I called that as well. But the one you're talking about was on the third anniversary of the show, so it must have been 85. He decides that they'll try to crown a late-night baby, and the baby will get all kinds of lifetime privileges if the child is born during the taping of the show. So there's a 1-hour window. And they have me at, I think, Lenox Hill Hospital. Right. And of all people, the guy who later became my nemesis, Vince McMahon, is staked out at another hospital. And we're vying to see which of us will get to preside over the birth of the late-night baby. And the baby actually was born at McMahon's hospital and got all of the perks and benefits that should come to the late-night baby. And then they came back to me, and in the maternity ward, the doctors and the nurses had prepared as if they were going to be the ones, and they had a cake, and they had party hats, and they had cigars and noisemakers and stuff. And I think what I said was, I turned to Letterman and I said, David, meanwhile, the party continues here as the plaintive cries of desperately ill men and women go unheeded. And Letterman really liked that. He threw back his head and laughed, and I think that sort of sealed the deal with me and David, and I kind of became a regular after that on the show.
And the other great part of that show, it was probably the second and third anniversary shows where I think my all-time favorite Lettermans. But the other part, he started making fun of Vince about halfway through the show. Vince was taking it like really a little too seriously. Right. And Letterman about halfway through was like, I'm just going to start making fun of this guy. And Vince, it really took him a while to realize he was kind of getting teased. And it was just great television. But yeah, as you said, you and Vince ended up crossing paths, 25 years later, 20 years later?
Geez, I guess it was, 2001, 2002 in the early days of my show on HBO. And the show was live at that time. And I think we had him slated for 15 minutes, but it got so tense that they just let it go. And, of course, on HBO, no commercials. So it was like 26, 27 minutes of mostly unrelenting tension. And it was a genuine television moment. And the funny part about it that few people remember is that the next guest, and the only buffer between Vince and the next guest, was just them running a promo for what would be on the next week. So maybe 45 seconds while I moved to the other part of the set to talk to guest number 2, who happened to be Bobby Knight. And I said, Bob, this is going to be the one time in your life when you are the most demure and genteel man on a show, because you can't follow this.
Wow. The other, going back to the mid-'80s for a second, the other thing that, for anybody who's grown up in the 80s, the beginning of the NFL on NBC studio show, when they would have the and they'd run the 3 greatest plays.
Right.
These iconic end of the game Hail Marys and stuff like this. It was still a little early. Like, obviously no YouTube during that time. The NFL films, ESPN wasn't running. These were really the only time to ever see any of these plays. And I remember being genuinely excited at 12:30 to see what 3 plays they would pick, and hoping the Patriots would be involved as a positive one and not a negative one. But
one they seemed to always pick, maybe because he was on the show, was a Hail Mary that the Vikings threw at the end of a game. I remember Charlie Jones and Len Dawson were calling the game, and Ahmad winds up catching the ball off a deflection in the back of the end zone as time expires. So we always ran that one in the package.
It was great. And there's one of those montages on YouTube, but in my opinion, they should all be on YouTube. So get on that, people.
Someday they will be.
People who are on YouTube. Hey, I wanted to ask you about the playoffs, since you did, how many did you do? 1 game or 2 for MLB
Yeah, I just
Network?
did 1. Pirates and Cardinals game 2 in St. Louis on Friday.
It looks like we're headed for Red Sox Dodgers, which means that we're not, because anytime it looks like the World Series that's going to happen in baseball, there's always a curveball. What are you expecting right now?
Well, if I had to pick, I'd pick Red Sox and Dodgers, because the Red Sox, as we speak, are up 2-0, and the Dodgers are up 2-1 as we speak. They will have played, since we're taping this, they will have played game 4 already. But let's say, for the sake of argument, and this is past tense now, but let's suppose that the Braves somehow win game 4 in Los Angeles and force the Dodgers to use Kershaw in game 5. Even if the Dodgers win that, and let's say the Pirates finish off the Cardinals in 4, then Kershaw can't pitch against the Pirates till game 3, and that would be in Pittsburgh. Yeah. Maybe that shifts the advantage a little bit to the Pirates in a scenario like that. Of course, for all I know, the Braves and Cardinals may come back and win and render all this moot, but that's baseball. As opposed to other sports, the likelihood that the team that's behind or the team that's slightly the lesser team wins is greater in baseball than in any other sport.
Obviously, I want any scenario where the Red Sox are in the World Series, but my worst case scenario would be Red Sox Pirates, because at that point, we become Cobra Kai. We're just nobody in America. We're 1980 USSR in that matchup. Everyone in America is rooting for the Pirates, and that would be terrible. At least Dodgers, it'd be a tiny bit more fun. What do you think's going to happen with Bud Selig, with the replacement?
Well, I think Bud is serious this time. I don't think there's going to be any change of heart, and I really don't know who his successor is going to be. There are legitimate candidates within baseball. Rob Manfred is one. Sandy Alderson, now with the Mets, but has the background and the intellect to do it. There are people who run teams. Dave Montgomery in Philadelphia might be a good choice. Terry McGurk with the Braves. Larry Baer has had tremendous success and knows the industry inside and out. President of the San Francisco Giants. So there are a lot of potential candidates.
What do you want from that candidate? What would be what one trait would the ideal commissioner have?
Well, I think that you have to give Bud Selig a whole lot of credit on balance. He started out in shaky fashion, but he's finishing in pretty strong fashion. But the one thing, and this is not really a criticism of Bud, everybody has their strengths and weaknesses. Bud has done a lot of good things. He doesn't always explain his position and baseball's position in the most dynamic way. So a younger guy who is a little bit more effective in communicating baseball's direction would be a good thing. I think the guy will probably, I assume it's going to be a man. I imagine there could be some female candidates, but he ought to continue a lot of Bud's initiatives. But I think maybe the one thing would be to keep in mind that as the game modernizes, you don't want to throw away a lot of what's appealing and distinct about baseball. For example, adding the second wild card, I think, was simultaneously a modernizing move and a nod toward the traditional because it put greater emphasis on the regular season. It matters more now to finish first as opposed to being one of the wild card qualifiers. And you could make a case that if you made the wild card round 2 out of 3, not only would that round be more legitimate, but it would further advantage the first place team because they'd get their rotation in order, and the wild card survivor would have to use at least 2 starting pitchers, maybe 3, and who knows how much of their bullpen they'd have to burn, plus they'd be more travel weary, and it would give a further advantage to the first place team. That's the kind of combination of modernizing while still maintaining baseball's distinctiveness that I would like the next person to be aware of.
Do you worry about the under 30 baseball fan base?
Not as much as some people do. There was a story in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago by Jonathan Mahler, and I was quoted in the story, and he quoted me accurately, and I respect Mahler, but I disagree with his basic premise, which is that baseball is somehow culturally irrelevant. With the exception of national television ratings, and baseball's circumstances when it comes to national television ratings are so different than football, and the comparisons, therefore, aren't really legitimate. But with the exception of that, which is a concern for baseball, but in every other measurable way, baseball isn't just ahead of where it used to be and way ahead of the so-called golden age of the sport. In every measurable way, it's ahead of those past eras in quantum leaps, in attendance, in marketing revenue, in total viewership when you cobble together local and regional, in people following baseball through fantasy leagues and in the internet and MLB.com, the MLB network, even overseas marketing. They've done extremely well. And I think that to compare them to football or to say, hey, it seems like Jay-Z and Lil Wayne like the NBA more than they like baseball, therefore baseball is culturally irrelevant. Well, what is that supposed to mean? Would baseball be better off if they shuttered Cooperstown? If they blew up Fenway Park and Wrigley Field? If they shut off Vin Scully's microphone? Nostalgia and retro are an aspect of baseball's appeal. They shouldn't apologize for it. They should embrace it. But to say that it's a disproportionate aspect of it is wrong. If you watch MLB Network, or if you follow baseball in all the various ways you can follow it, let's say for a week, and you really kept track, you sat there with a stopwatch, 95% of it is about the here and now. It's about exciting young players. It's about strategies and trades and debates about what's going on right now. So if 5% of it is historical or retro or nostalgic, and that's more than other sports, why should baseball apologize for that? That's part of what baseball is about. Would baseball be better off if they traded that in exchange for Lil Wayne wearing MLB garb in between prison stints? I don't think that would be a positive.
I think the one thing that's changed, obviously other than the time of the game, which hasn't really changed that much, but it just feels different in the current era we live in where everything
You're
has
right
to be
about that.
But the one thing that's really changed to me is that baseball has become so much more localized. Because you look at what the Dodgers got for cable, for their cable contract. They got like $8.5 billion. So clearly baseball, it's not struggling in any way. From a local revenue standpoint, it's as good as it's ever been from attendance, all that stuff.
Yep.
But I think the difference is I just watch my own team. I used to kind of follow what was going on. I'd watch Yankee games. I'd watch Dodger games. I'll watch some Dodgers now just because if it's at night, I'm doing emails. I'll have some Vin Scully in the background. But for the most part, I just want to see my own team. And it seems like a lot of people feel that way. And that makes me wonder, like, in 5 years from now, what are the ratings going to be like for the national, the Wednesday night ESPN game and things like that? Are people just going to be like, I want to watch my own team. I don't care about watching Cincinnati and St. Louis. I just don't care.
Well, and that's what I was saying when I was quoted in this New York Times essay. When I said to Jonathan Mahler, we were talking about the context of baseball's national television ratings woes, which is really the only important area where they're down, but it is an important one. And I said to him, look, if the Bengals played the Buccaneers in the Super Bowl, it would have less buzz than the Patriots and the Cowboys, but it would only affect the ratings by a small degree. because it's the Super Bowl. It's
Yep.
one game. It's a national holiday. But same two cities. If the Reds played the Rays in the World Series, then baseball is screwed at least that 1 year in the national television ratings. It would actually be a good thing if the Reds or Rays made the World Series, or if the Pirates make the World Series this year. A good thing in other ways, because it would show that baseball has moved closer and closer to something like competitive balance. And all the smaller revenue teams that have made the playoffs this year is actually a good thing for baseball. But when it comes to national television ratings, there's only a handful of teams. The Red Sox, the Dodgers, the Yankees, the Cubs, if they ever got into it, the Cardinals to a lesser extent because they have a regional following. Only a handful of teams that really move the needle. So as we speak, Fox is praying for the Dodgers against the Red Sox because in the short term, that would make a much more dramatic difference than market differences would make in football. So, what you say is correct.
Well, and then you look at, like, if the NBA had a finals in 2014 and it was Oklahoma City versus Indiana, which the baseball equivalent of that would be a disaster for a rating standpoint.
And yet, wouldn't you and I think it was cool? I would think it was cool.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it'd be a great series. Second of all, you'd have Durant in there, and probably that means Paul George would have ascended to become a superstar. So you'd have a little Durant versus Paul George. I think the ratings would go down because you'd have two small markets. But from an interest standpoint, I think people would care just as much as they did about Miami, San Antonio last year. Now, if you had a World Series of Pittsburgh versus Detroit this year, I think a lot of people would check out. And that's the part I want to see how baseball handles that dichotomy over these next 10 years, that if it's not your own team or if it's not a team you have a history with, are you going to sit through these 3.5-hour World Series games? Do you think they should really think long and hard about how to make these games move faster?
Yes, I do. Because baseball should have a leisurely pace. It's part of what distinguishes it from other sports. But there's a difference between a leisurely pace and a lethargic pace, which it often has now. Now, some of that has to do, especially in the postseason, with lengthy commercial breaks, and you're not going to do anything about that because that's where the money comes from. But I think they should do everything they possibly can to move things along. It starts with calling the high strike. If pitchers feel like they can get ahead in the count and batters aren't able to work counts as deep as they have been in recent years, then you're going to get at-bats concluded in fewer pitches. It's not going to go back to how it used to be, but you might be able to improve it incrementally, and every other way they can to move things along. You don't have to have a personal theme song every single at-bat as you stroll from the on-deck circle to the plate. Get in there and hit. Get on the mound and pitch.
What if we just made it the guy can't leave the batter's box? You get in the batter's box, you're there. You can't step out, can't adjust your batting gloves, can't do your little 360 whirl around while you're getting attention for 25 seconds. It's just we move along. I was watching, some All-Star game from the 70s last year, and I was stunned by just the pace, and that's what we've lost. And I'm not quite sure how we've lost that, but the batters went in, the pitcher threw it to them, he got the ball back, he looked for the sign, he threw it again, and it just moved.
Well, a lot of this too is you can't ask teams to do things that they perceive as against their best interest when they're trying to win. And with advanced metrics and understanding of what improves your percentage of winning, a lot of these teams are looking to get into hitters' counts, and they're looking to build the pitch count. And they're looking to do damage in the 5th, 6th, and 7th innings against the middle of the bullpen before you get to the back of the bullpen, where every team just about has a closer that the opposition would rather not face. So, it's part of the strategy, actually, to run the count as deep as possible. And so you've got things working at cross purposes. Managers and teams are trying to win, and very often that slows the game down.
Do you think this advanced metrics movement, which is more than a movement, it's how we digest baseball now, and you almost can't watch it unless you're versed in some of the different stats. Do you think this is, for the most part, it's been fun as baseball fans, but for the big picture of it's turned into a haves versus a have-nots type of situation where you have all of these people having one discussion about baseball using all these different numbers, and then you have everybody else on the other side who either just watch the games casually or they're kind of almost a little scared by the numbers. Like they feel they're not equipped to even be in these conversations. Is that a good thing?
Well, if people have heard me do games in recent years, and I don't do that many of them on the MLB Network, but I do about a dozen a year, they can tell that I'm trying to balance the two. I think that the new metrics are very interesting and very valid, but at the same time, people want to enjoy a ball game. And so there's a place for these metrics. It's with Bill James, or it's reading Rob Nyer, or whatever it might be. There is a place for it, but it shouldn't overwhelm and suffocate the basic rhythms and the appeal of a ball game. There are times when you want to note it because it's part of the strategy of the game, and it's good to know. But you can't let it overwhelm what always has been kind of the classic appeal of the game.
When you see like something, Max Scherzer's 19-1, and Brian Kenny came on, we argued about this. He wants to kill the win. Do we need to kill the win? Do we need to go that far? Like, can't the win just be one of the many things we use as we're trying to figure out if somebody had a good season? It doesn't have to be the number one thing, but it could be like the 15th thing we look at.
Yeah. What you want, I think, is a blend of the traditional understandings of the game, including the old-time scouts and the fundamentals of baseball, and you want to blend it with the new metrics and all the new information that's coming our way. Now, everybody's going to come down with a different proportion. Brian Kenny is going to emphasize sabermetrics more than I do, but they each have their place. And I enjoy watching Brian Kenny for a half an hour or an hour at a time when there isn't a game going on. But if Brian Kenny were calling a game, and that was all he talked about during the game, and you weren't getting enough of the feel of the ballpark and the buzz of the crowd and some of the anecdotes and quirks and backstories and things that make the game interesting and appealing, then I think something would be lost. But there's an important place for Brian Kenny and people like him. It's just that you have to blend it. You just can't let it be the be-all and end-all.
Yeah, and I'd like to see, we talked, when Brian came on the podcast like 6 weeks ago, and we were talking about baseball play-by-play and how, for whatever reason, this is something that really hasn't evolved in any way. And it's like you listen, whoever your team is and whoever the radio guys are, the TV guys, there's a certain rhythm to the game. There's a rhythm to the jokes. Like the jokes usually aren't even really jokes. They talk about these stories that happened 40 years ago. They avoid the advanced stats completely. It's these games are announced for the most part the exact same way we did it in 1974. I'm not sure that makes sense either. Obviously there are exceptions. You do it differently. I heard some of your game that you did. Like there should be a blend of the two worlds, and I'm not quite sure why we stopped trying with baseball broadcasting for the most part. It's just this 1974 way of doing it. Well, why? Why do we do it that way?
Look, nobody is perfect, myself included. But one of the things I prided myself on was when I first started at NBC and people started to take notice of me, someone wrote that I have a Red Barber side and a David Letterman side. And I think what they were saying was that I had a traditional structure and an appreciation of the traditions of the craft, but a little bit of a younger frame of reference. And while I'm not a younger guy anymore, I think if you listen to me do baseball now, you still have that respect for the pace and rhythm of a game and the basic craft, which really can't be improved upon. And you want to improve upon how Vin Scully did it or Jack Buck or Ernie Harwell did it? I don't think so. I think all you want to do is do that with an updated frame of reference, an updated cultural frame of reference that's appropriate. Yours is different from mine, and somebody who comes along now is 25 is going to have something else again. So you're going to have a different cultural reference. Vin Scully might be talking about Glenn Miller. I might be talking about Billy Joel or Bruce Springsteen, and somebody else might be talking about Lil Wayne. That's always going to change, but the structure of how a baseball game should be called and called well is not going to be that much different. But one of the things I've tried to add is sabermetrics. And I've tried to do it, like I said, in a way that doesn't get in the way of people's basic enjoyment of the game. And if you have a little bit of skill, you can weave it in there without changing the basic pace and rhythm of how the broadcast is done.
And let's face it, Vince Scully might be an alien. I mean, you just shouldn't be able to do this in your late 80s. He's still
amazing.
By himself.
Right.
There's just nothing like it. I don't understand. Like, he's 23 years older than my dad, and he's doing these baseball games every night by himself. I don't think he's human.
It's not just impressive. It's astonishing.
It has no correlation to anything.
No. It is the word unique is misused when you hear people say this is very unique or it's quite unique. Well, it's either unique or it's not. And most things, when people say they're unique, they really mean they're rare or exceptional. But then there are the very few things that actually are unique. And Vin Scully is completely unique. He is sui generis. There has never been anybody like him before, and there won't be anybody like him again.
Greatest game you ever called?
Probably regular season game, the so-called Sandberg game in 1984, Cardinals and Cubs at Wrigley Field, June of 84. So you have a terrific rivalry. It's not like Yankees-Red Sox because they've never been good at the same time, so it's never been cutthroat, and the nature of the cities and the teams is different. But it's a friendly rivalry, but still one that matters. So you see a lot of Cubs fans at Busch Stadium. You see a lot of Cardinal fans at Wrigley Field. Beautiful Saturday afternoon when the game of the week was still the game of the week before superstations and the Internet and ESPN and MLB Network had rendered what Fox now has as just another game. The NBC game of the week was a game where people, if you lived in Montana, you didn't mow your lawn during those 3 hours because that was the one baseball game you could see at that time with either Vin Scully and Joe Garagiola or me and Tony Kubek. So we're doing this game, and the Cardinals go out in front 9-3, and the Cubs rally back, and Sandberg comes up. And at that point, that was really the game that established him as an MVP candidate. That was his coming out on a national stage, and it truly was a national stage. Very often, those games would get a rating of 9 or 10. Think about that. A regular season Saturday game getting the same rating or maybe greater as some World Series games or LCS games now get. So Sandberg comes up, and he hits a home run to tie the game off Suter at 9-9. Willie McGee hits for the cycle, hits a double in extra innings, puts the Cardinals up 11-9. Sandberg comes up again with 2 out and a man on first, and this was a different era, so Suter's still pitching. He pitched like 3 innings in relief that game, and Sandberg homers again off Suter to tie the game 11-11, and at that point it's his 5th hit of the game. The Cubs eventually win the game 12-11, and now it's almost 30 years later, and I swear to you, Bill, I can be in Chicago. It doesn't happen as often as it once did, but it still happens. I could be walking down the street in Chicago, and someone rolls down the window of their car and says, "Hey, Bob, the Sandberg game." So it still resonates.
Wow. And also, that's kind of an indictment of how bad it's been for Cubs fans, too. Right?
Yeah, well, they went to the playoffs that year and led the Padres 2-0.
Leon
and the
Durham.
whole thing slipped away. Led Game 5, 3-0. Whole thing slipped away. Sandberg himself has told me that he has the tape of that game, and from time to time he pops it in and just gets a glow from watching it.
The one thing I wanted to mention, you on the MLB Network, you guys showed some baseball movies, and you would do an interview with somebody who was involved in the movie.
Yeah, that was fun.
Kind of buried. It was like one of those. I don't know. They must have. When did they start showing those? During the winter or the spring or?
Yeah, like in January, February.
Yeah, it was one of those. It was kind of under the radar. I enjoyed those though. I thought it was a good idea. I especially liked the Barry Levinson natural one was good, but I thought it was a good idea. I wish you had done like 20 of them.
Yeah, we did 5 or 6. We did Gina Davis talking about and Penny Marshall talking about A League of Their Own. Penny Marshall had a great line. She said that she actually wanted Demi Moore for Gina Davis's role as the star catcher.
Wow!
But then when they were about to begin shooting, Demi Moore turned out to be pregnant, and then Penny Marshall paused for a second and said, "So Bruce Willis literally screwed her out of the part." We had John Cusack. We had John Cusack talking about 8 Men Out, along with John Sayles, who was the screenwriter and directed it. It was fun
the now super underrated 8 Men Out.
Correct.
I think you need to expand the idea though and do a couple stinkers. Like I think you should have the kid from Little Big League. That's one. Like don't be afraid to delve into the lousy baseball film side. I think Bad News Bears go to Japan. Maybe you bring in I don't know who, but don't be afraid.
Yeah.
Play both sides of the fence.
I think it's an outstanding idea, and I'll tell you this: that a lot of the things that I'm most proud of or got the most satisfaction out of doing were the things that were not seen by that many people. A lot of the things that I've done on HBO or the things that I've done on Major League Baseball Network have tiny audiences compared to the Olympics or Sunday Night Football. But a lot of times, those are the things off the beaten path that really have something different about them, and that really connect with people, even if not as many people see them.
Well, I like that you keep trying stuff. At some point, we have to get you involved in a 30 for 30. I'm not sure how. It'll probably have to be like that Weird Al Michaels trade where we had to trade rabbits and stuff to whatever. But
exactly.
Maybe we could trade NBC something to get you for 1 hour of some documentary. I'm
in this free spirits thing, and I have seen it. And Dan Forrer did a tremendous job as the producer of this program, and I hope a lot of people watch it tonight. I know the baseball players are going on at the same time, but you can DVR it or whatever. It really captures a strange period of time in pro basketball history.
Well, the good news about 30 for 30 is the rewatchers. They always have a life. People watch them. They'll get it the seventh, the eighth time. The audience will always eventually get there. We learned a couple years ago not to get caught up because some baseball playoff game just destroyed whatever rating we were going to get. It seems like eventually they'll catch up. I think this one is going to be one of those rewatchable ones that, you think it's like a B+ the first time, but then all of a sudden it's the fourth time and you just want to see the one Marvin Barnes part again, and all of a sudden you've seen it 5 times.
Before I let you go here, or you let me go, however you want to figure it.
Yeah, I took an hour of your time. I feel bad.
Yeah, you did. But what else do I have to do? Just popped into my head. It's one of the things about sports that's so great, and no one is as interested in combining pop culture with sports as you are. So this may interest you. We were talking about the Sandberg game.
Yeah.
The first time I ever met Bill Murray, and as you know, Bill is a huge Cubs fan. In fact, he has a son whom he named Homer Banks Murray. So now it's like the winter of 1985. It's like January or February of 1985. And during the summer of 84, I later found out, Bill was in Europe shooting a movie. Bill was pals with Ahmad, still is. So I'm in my apartment in New York, and I get a call, and it's Ahmad. He says, "Are you home?" I say, "Yeah." He goes, "I'll be there in 10 minutes. I go, "Fine." So the doorbell rings. I open the door, and Ahmad is standing there with a guy who in the first split second, I think he's literally picked up off a street corner. He's got a knit cap on, kind of dressed in some sort of vagrant kind of way. And then I realize it's Bill Murray. And he looks at me and he says, "I understand you have a tape of the Sandberg game." Now, understand what that meant in 1984-85. It meant big VHS tapes, each of which could hold an hour. So there were 5 of them because the game lasted 4.5 hours. And he says, I was in Europe. I didn't see the Sandberg game. So now I sit down with Murray and Ahmad, and we're rewatching the Sandberg game. And Murray is in heaven. I mean, that's what sports at its best is. It's quirky. It can't be explained, but it connects people.
That's great. And to bring this full circle, those ABA, like none of the tapes exist. Like you said, we showed one Spirits game once on ESPN Classic a couple of times. When I was researching my basketball book, and I was like, somebody was helping me out with tapes so I could see some different guys from the 60s and 70s. And I was like, I'm going to need some Dr. J tapes and a couple Marvin Barnes. And they were like, "No, we don't have those." And I was like, "You don't have those?" It's like, we don't have anything from the ABA. We have like 8 games. And that's it. And there was like some Indiana Pacers documentary somebody made that had footage in it. And there was the 76 All-Star game they had. But other than that, just came and went, and just people like you got to watch the games, and that was it. So pretty cool. Bob Costas, it was a pleasure.
Thank you, Bill. Take care.
Thanks for coming on the BS Report. Hopefully we get to talk to you again. Good luck with the baseball playoffs.
Thanks a lot. See ya.
All right. Bye-bye.
Target% off. Whoa.
Thank you for downloading the BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Too much fun.
Check out more podcasts at the iTunes Music Store or at Podcenter at ESPNradio.com.
Peace out.
Gotta say, Golick, great call on grabbing Subway for lunch and getting guacamole on our subs.
Told you this new guac really amps up the flavor.
Yep, something adding up things can be great. Guacamole on your sub, a new co-host to replace you.
What was that?
Oh, no, nothing.
Subway now has deliciously rich new guacamole made from ripe Hass avocados with just a hint of garlic, onion, and jalapeno. Discover how new guacamole turns up the flavor on any of your freshly made favorites. Subway, eat fresh.